to remind you of what I said with the children this morning. Advent tells us Christ is near. In many ways, we tend to think of that only in terms of marking time till Christmas. I mean, the lights are up. Many people have already put their Christmas trees up. And so in some ways, it seems like a shock to come here this morning and hear words not about the birth of a sweet little baby Jesus in Bethlehem, because the rest of the world has already gone there, but instead to hear these words about what we call the end times. Many people have a fascination with all things concerning what we call the end times. And certainly that fascination is called to mind by the reading that we hear this morning, a passage from the 13th chapter of Mark, a passage which is often referred to as Mark's little apocalypse. The word apocalypse means revelation. The term apocalyptic literature describes writings that refer to what we call the end times, the time and events leading up to the long-awaited day of the Lord, the time when God sets all things right, the time when God's reign on earth is known in fullness throughout the whole world. Such writings typically make use of very colorful and sometimes coded imagery. That is, symbols that mean something specific to the community that knows them and not much of anything to anyone outside of that community. These writings usually arose during times of great tribulation. A lot of them are in the Old Testament, though the book of Revelation in the New Testament is an example of an apocalyptic writing in the New Testament. They arose during times of great tribulation when the community of the faithful were being exploited and oppressed by a ruling power. The imagery described the passing away of that power and the coming of a new day. So these images were meant to give the oppressed community hope and to kindle in them a desire to remain steadfast in the midst of whatever the tribulation was at that particular point in history. They were coded because the images often referred to events that, if spoken outright, would have been seen as treasonous by those in power. Therefore, those who knew what the coded images meant were encouraged and given hope, while those who did not know what they meant would either hear them as mere nonsense, or, if they heard them as anything, might hear them as referring only to spiritual things. Now, keeping this understanding of apocalyptic writing in mind, it should not be surprising that when life in the present becomes unusually difficult, people tend to become fascinated with the end times, the time when all will be set right, the time when Jesus says the old age will pass away and a new age will begin. This is what Jesus is talking about with his disciples in this passage from Mark 13. He's speaking of a time in their own lives when one age would pass away and a new age would begin. And if you remember from the reading, he says to them that all of this will happen. All of this will take place before their generation ever passes away. In the reading, what we're hearing is Jesus talking to his disciples as they're coming out of the temple. They were awestruck by the size and the magnificence of the temple. And we need, of course, to remember that in Jesus' time, the temple was the center of your relationship with God. Even if you didn't live in Jerusalem, you tried to go there for feasts or festivals. It was the place where God's presence was most focused. And as good Jews, Jesus and his disciples honored the temple, and they observed the feasts and the festivals. But on this occasion, as they walked out of the temple and commented on its magnificence, Jesus tells them that someday that whole magnificent temple will be thrown down. Not one stone, he says, will be left upon another. Now, as you might imagine, the disciples want to know, when is this going to happen? Tell us when this is going to happen. And so Jesus replies with a very long discourse that involves all of the apocalyptic imagery that they all would have known. A discourse that includes the passage that we had this morning. And as all apocalyptic writing does, it makes use of images that were used throughout the apocalyptic writings of the Old Testament. Some of these appearing in prophets like Joel and Isaiah, speaking of the sun going out and the world being darkened. Some of them were from the book of Daniel. And Jesus uses that imagery to liken the day of the cataclysmic throwing down of the temple to the end times, to the passing of one age to the next. He says it will be like the sun being darkened and like the stars are falling from heaven. In other words, it'll be like their whole world has fallen apart. But in the midst of this, he says, in the midst of all this upheaval and suffering, he tells them that no matter how bad things get, the Son of Man will set things right. Son of Man, a term for the Messiah. Now, at the time the Gospel of Mark was written, which was nearly 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, somewhere around 70 in the Common Era, it would have seemed to those reading it that all of these things that Jesus had talked about had indeed come to pass in their generation, as he said they would, before anything had passed away. Because sometime around the year 66, there had been a Jewish rebellion among the Jews in Judea. It's known as the Great Revolt. The Jewish rebels seized the Roman military garrison of Judea, and all of the Roman officials fled the region. They sent the Syrian army in, supposedly to stop the rebellion, which they didn't expect to be very hard, and to their surprise, the Syrian armies were soundly defeated by the Jewish rebels. So the Roman leadership stepped up their effort. By the year 67, Roman legions began sweeping through the countryside, starting with Galilee and going all over, just wreaking havoc. The Jewish revolt finally ended when the Roman legions recaptured Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. And at that time, they destroyed the temple, threw it down. Not one stone left upon stone. Those years, from 66 CE to 70 CE and shortly thereafter, were indeed years of great tribulation and great suffering. Now, remembering that the Gospel of Mark was being written while all of this was going on, we need to realize that the imagery we see in Mark was very concrete to the first audience who heard it. When Jesus speaks of the tearing down of the temple and of all of the events, those were events they were living through. And those were the events that would have been brought to mind. When he speaks of the Son of Man coming on clouds, if you notice, that's in quotes. It's a quotation because it's a title. It's a title used in the Old Testament to talk about the Messiah returning. To them, that would have been something they really hoped for. When Jesus speaks of a time after the great suffering, as this passage is introduced, it would have been the suffering that they already were experiencing that was brought to their minds. And when he spoke in apocalyptic imagery that would have been familiar to each and every one of them, it would have been the possibility that Christ was near that would have meant the most to them. Because, see, to be reminded that Jesus himself had talked about the throwing down of the temple, and that Jesus himself had saw it not as a defeat, but as the birth pains of a new age. To hear that, and to remember that Jesus has said that, would have given them both hope and strength Because in these times, with the temple torn down, their way of living in relationship to God was being yanked out from under them. And for them, that was not just about going someplace on Sabbath. It was about the way they lived their whole lives. It really was for them an end time. Because the old age of a Judaism centered on temple worship was passing away, and a new age was beginning. And of course, we know today that this new age not only saw the rise of a different kind of Judaism that exists today, but also the rise of our own religion, Christianity. The message through all of this, the message that Jesus was saying to those first disciples, the message that Mark recalls him saying in his gospel to a community that's under great stress and tribulation and suffering and wondering what in the world their life is going to look like. The message was this: be awake, be alert to this change, and see in it that Christ is doing a new thing. That's also the message of Mark 13 for us today. Whether it brings to mind what happened way back then, or whether it brings to mind what will happen on the future day of the Lord with the second coming, or whether it brings to mind what's going on in our own personal lives or in our culture now, the message is the same. Be awake. Be alert. Christ is near. That's why it's so important not to let our fascination with the end times prevent us from seeing Jesus' call to be awake right now, right here. Jesus called to wake up to the nearness of Christ in the midst of the changes and chances of this life. As Mark 13 says, one place to look for this is in the days of our own suffering. In those times of our lives when it feels as though the sun and the moon have both disappeared. Those times in our lives when it feels like heaven and earth have been shaken. This may be a very personal kind of suffering that some of you are experiencing right now because of something that's happened to you. Or it may be a more vicarious kind of suffering that we experience on behalf of the whole world and the challenges that we as a culture face today. The message is that when we feel that pain, Jesus says, wake up and look closely. For that's when the Son of Man, the Savior, the Messiah, Christ, is nearby. Wake up to the nearness. Be alert, because at those times there's something to be seen and there's something to be heard. So see it, look for it, hear it, listen for it, and let the wisdom and the compassion of Christ lead us out of whatever darkness we're experiencing and into the light. Another place in this passage that it says to look for the nearness of Christ is suggested by that image of a fig tree or any tree budding forth in spring. You know what it's like after the bleakness and the coldness of winter, if you let yourself experience the bleakness and coldness of winter. What it's like for the first buds to come on a tree and to signal that that winter is about to pass into spring, and you know it's going to pass into spring, it's going to be summer before you know it. Because the cold and bleakness of winter passes away, and the new age of spring and summer comes on. Jesus says, let that speak to your life. Don't be afraid of the winters of your life, or the winters of your life as a community, or a city, or a culture, or a church, or a nation, or a world. Don't be afraid of the winters. Let yourself experience the bleakness and know that in that bleakness, something is about to bud forth. And be awake and alert for the budding. Be aware of the changes, and look and listen within the change itself for the holy wisdom and the holy compassion of the Christ. the one who is Lord of all the seasons of life. And within each one bears what needs to be born. Advent is a wake-up call to us. Not just a way of counting down to Christmas. Not just a way to say, sometime, someday, we won't have to worry about all of this anymore. It is a wake-up call to look at our lives now. In whatever season those lives are in whatever times of tribulation we ourselves face or those around us face, to wake up, to look, and to listen. Because Advent tells us Christ is near.